Perfect. Once again, big thank you to all our speakers. Due to the shortage of time, we're going to take one question for each speaker, but I'll say all these questions will be posted again on the IMBeR app, and you know, feel free to continue conversations in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to first ask a question to Priscilla. Priscilla, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Excellent. So the question is, local communities do not only need to have a voice, but also a vote. Sometimes they're heard, but more often what they say is not taken into account. How would you propose to take this further? And how do we make policymakers mandatory, including the voice of these communities?
Well, I think it depends on the context, on the country where you are. For example, in Brazil, depending on the arrangement that's being done, the local communities have a voice and a vote. When I actually say have a voice, I mean like they are heard and they can vote. And I think that's the idea that's already in the MSP planning anyway. Like the whole idea of MSP includes having them have a real voice, not just like saying things, but being heard and voting. But for example, here in Brazil, I think depending on the arrangement we are talking about, depending on the type of MPA, their voices, their votes are assured by legislation. So I would say it's hard to propose something very general for the whole world, and I think it depends on a case by case or on a country by country to try to embed this into legislation. Maybe there can be some more general directive to make sure that their voices and votes are heard and considered in the end. But I assume it's always going to be hard and difficult when there are many powerful players.
Great. Thank you, Priscilla. I would now like to, Shanta, are you still here?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So one of the questions we have for you is, so how, you've shown how fishermen can, you have involved them. How would you promote the involvement in fishermen to participate in conservation processes when there is historical animosity between fishermen and conservation agencies? Do you handle, or how do you address this issue of, fishermen and animosity between conservation agency and fishermen?
Well, in Bangladesh, I think I would like to say that the common concept that fishermen are not willing to include themselves in the conservation process, in our case, I think it's not the case. In fact, when we have interviewed them at sea and during community consultations, they were really interested to get involved and help in the conservation process because they consider dolphins as their friends. They consider that if these marine wildlife are there, they will have more catch. So, yeah, I think this differs a little bit locally. If we choose the right way to let them know why this is important, I think they are really interested to get involved in conservation.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is to Kira.
Yes, go for it.
Excellent. So there are many examples where people cannot give a value or weight to areas which are important to them. So a case of, if I say one thing is important, it means the rest might be taken away. How might one overcome this when conducting participatory research for spatial planning and prioritization?
Yeah, it's a very tricky one for sure, and I don't think there's a pat answer to it. I think a lot of it has to do with mutual trust, and that's a difficult one really when you're talking about what tends to be quite top-down MSP. I mean, it's a reality for sure, and it's the experience, of course, of MSP that it is a give and take, and it's probably not possible to hold on to everything in every instance. But I think the answer is to actually be fairly honest from the beginning and actually say, you know, MSP, it's not a magic bullet. It's a negotiation. It's going to be quite a tough negotiation as well. But if we don't actually voice those values, if we don't actually even put them on the table, then they're going to be lost for sure, because then the other interests are just going to come in and ignore them completely. So yeah, I think it's a question of playing with your cards quite open and actually say it as it is, really, to be honest.
Absolutely, we need to start somewhere. Thank you for that. The next question is to Marlena. We have you here, Marlena?
Yes, I'm here.
The question is, how do you balance ocean grabbing in the form of commercially driven ocean economy and social needs in poverty-stricken coastal communities?
Okay, so you're asking me, how do you balance ocean grabbing in places that have economic need?
Yeah, absolutely. And can I just add another question to that? Shouldn't ocean grabbing be like land grabbing, where somebody illegally acquires what belongs to somebody else?
Okay.
So that's two questions. Yeah.
So I'm going to start with the second question. I think part of the issue is that many times, as I was trying to show at the policymaking levels, the voices and representation of the folks on the ground are hardly ever present. So even as policy gets developed, a lot of the voices that would influence what that policy would look like are not there to say. So the question and what it ends up being legal is almost it tilted or biased towards the representation of mainstream or dominant values and economic gains or whatever goals they have, compared to more local scale governance structures or what have you. And an example of that too is within, for example, the United Nations and the DRIP laws, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, that has basically the declaration that Indigenous folks should have the right to free, prior, and informed consent. Many countries are signed onto that international agreement, but very few countries actually abide by it in terms of informing or giving free and informed consent to communities where a lot of these economically driven projects are trying to establish themselves. So I guess I'm a bit, I definitely vouch for, and this kind of plugs into the ocean grabbing and within developing countries and economic need. Many of the final examples I gave, whether it's in Mexico with the community of Cherán, even the Zapatistas in Chiapas in Mexico, or other communities, it's almost like through the pursuit of autonomy and their own definitions of what the life world that they want to exist in. For example, with the Quechua in Ecuador as well, it's like they've almost decided to pursue their own definition of what living well means. So I think it's a difficult question because obviously you have a spectrum of people in a country, right, in a nation state, but at least from the small scale local communities, it's almost like trying to find a balance, right, turning inward towards the forms that have been driven by subsistence and that are culturally, I guess, significant as well. But yeah, each community is going to decide what strategies and what features they're going to seek out. And so obviously that's going to vary by context, and that's a decision that different communities have to make across, coasts, etc.
Right. Thank you so much, Anna. I'd like now to ask the last question to Palermo. You're here?
Yeah.
Yeah, the question is, so what is the way forward for the players in the high seas if they don't talk to each other? How do we go forward?
I mean, I think some players do talk to each other within some of the existing bodies. So players within a regional fisheries management organization do talk to each other. But I guess the question was when organizations like the deep sea bed mining and the shipping and the fishing don't talk. And I think this new treaty will provide a framework through which they can talk to each other and can engage in cross-sectoral management. I'm not sure how successful it will be because the way these negotiations have unfolded, they agreed that the new treaty could not undermine any of the existing instruments. And that's a legal interpretation, and some people are taking it as the new treaty should not talk about fishing because fishing is the competence of RFMOs, or it should not talk about how shipping is conducted because that's the IMO, right? So I think more pressure is required from civil society, but also a lot more pressure is required from coastal and island nations and coastal peoples, because the high seas are quite far geographically, and I think they're also quite far psychologically. And what we haven't really fully understood yet or realized is that whatever happens in the high seas affects all of our efforts of conservation and sustainable management and MSP within our coastal ocean. So how right now we're seeing, for instance, the Galapagos Islands, the archipelago is surrounded by a fleet of almost 300 fishing vessels of a particular nation. And so how upsetting is it that all the efforts within this archipelago for decades are now compromised by what's happening 201 nautical miles out? So coordination between coastal and island nations is crucial. And coastal and island nations have to wake up to the fact that they are connected to each other and to the high seas, because otherwise we're going to see, again, this handful of players taking advantage of the freedom of the high seas to empty out the oceans.
Great, thank you so much. Again, great, thank you to all our speakers. We had some really interesting and fascinating talks, and I wish we had more time for Q&A, but we are running behind time. So we are going to go on a short 12-minute break now, and we will reconvene in 15 minutes for the second half of the workshop today. So yeah, if we all just come back, we'll get started in 15 minutes. Thank you once again to each and every one of our speakers. It was excellent. We really enjoyed it. Thank you.